Welcome to Life Stories, where we bring you heartfelt tales of courage, love, and transformation. Today's story is one of redemption and second chances, a journey of a powerful businessman, a struggling single mother, and a brave little girl whose love and resilience change their lives forever. It's a story about finding hope in the darkest moments, rebuilding a life together, and discovering the true meaning of family. Subscribe to Life Stories and join us as we begin today's heartwarming journey. Let this tale remind you that no matter how broken life may seem, there's always a chance to grow something beautiful. It was a sweltering summer afternoon in New York City, and the sidewalks were a chaotic symphony of hurried footsteps, chatter, and the occasional honk of car horns. Among the crowd strode Ethan Montgomery, the very image of success, his tailored suit impeccable, his watch gleaming under the relentless sun. To any onlooker, he was a man untouchable, confident, and firmly in control of his destiny. At 42 years old, Ethan had built an empire through sheer determination, often by outmaneuvering anyone bold enough to challenge him. His prematurely silver hair and sharp eyes gave him a commanding presence that people both respected and feared. Ethan was absorbed in his thoughts, mentally drafting a sharp email to his team, when a sudden jostle disrupted his stride. Initially, he brushed it off, attributing it to the throng of people rushing past. But as his hand instinctively reached for his pocket, his heart sank. His wallet was gone. It wasn't just the money that mattered. That wallet held his life in neatly organized compartments: credit cards, identification, business contacts, and even a photograph of his late father. He spun on his heel, his eyes scanning the crowd, and spotted a fleeting figure weaving skillfully through the chaos. It was a girl, no older than 11 or 12, her thin frame darting like a shadow among the pedestrians. The tattered dress and worn-out sneakers she wore made her intentions clear. "Stop right there, you thief!" Ethan's voice boomed across the street, drawing the startled glances of passers-by. The girl hesitated for a fraction of a second but then bolted deeper into the crowd, clutching something tightly to her chest. Ethan felt a surge of anger. But more than that, it was his pride that stung. He wasn't the type of man people stole from, not without consequences. Adjusting his tie, he muttered under his breath, "You picked the wrong man, little girl." Ethan's towering frame plowed through the sidewalk, and people quickly stepped aside to let him pass. The girl moved like a frightened cat, slipping between food carts and pedestrians. Vendors yelled in frustration as she upset their neatly arranged goods. And Ethan, focused solely on her, trampled over fallen merchandise without a second thought. With every step, the girl's movements grew more frantic. She glanced over her shoulder, her wide, dark eyes meeting Ethan's piercing gaze. There was fear there, and something else, a kind of desperate determination that unsettled him. Still, he pressed on, his breath steady from years of boxing at an exclusive club. His anger boiled into words that spilled out in taunts. "You can't run forever," he growled. "You're only making this worse for yourself." The chase took them down increasingly narrow alleyways, places Ethan had never ventured before. The clean lines and polished glass of Midtown gave way to the crumbling brick walls and dimly lit corners of an entirely different world. The scent of street food mingled with the sharp tang of garbage, and the noise of the city faded into a dull hum. Ethan hated it, the grit, the disorder, the overwhelming humanity of it all. He was closing in now, and the girl's pace faltered. She was small and fast, but she couldn't outrun him forever. Finally, she made a desperate dash into a dark alley, her sandals slapping against the uneven pavement. Ethan stopped at the entrance, adjusting his cuffs and taking a moment to catch his breath. "Nowhere left to run," he muttered, stepping into the shadows with slow, deliberate strides. Inside, the air was thick and damp. Dim light filtered through the cracks between buildings, casting long, ominous shadows. Ethan's polished shoes echoed against the concrete as he advanced. He spotted her crouched behind a rusted trash bin, nervously counting the contents of his wallet. Her small, dirt-streaked fingers trembled as she fumbled through the bills. "What a pathetic sight," Ethan sneered, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Stealing from someone like me? Do you have any idea who I am?" The girl froze at the sound of his voice, clutching the crumpled cash in her hands. She looked up, her tear-streaked face smudged with grime. "Please, sir," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to." Ethan laughed coldly, stepping closer. "Didn't mean to? You've got my wallet in your hands. And you didn't mean to? That's rich." He towered over her, his shadow swallowing her tiny frame. "Do you even know how much this suit costs?" he mocked. "More than you could steal in a year." But then, something in her expression made him pause. It wasn't just fear, it was a profound, gut-wrenching despair. The girl's trembling voice broke through his tirade. "I had no choice," she said, her words punctuated by quiet sobs. "My mom, she's sick. She needs medicine. And we can't afford it. Please. I just needed enough to help her." For a moment, Ethan was speechless. He had heard his share of sob stories in business, most of them manipulative ploys for sympathy. But this was different. The raw desperation in her voice, the tears streaming down her face, they didn't feel like a performance. He glanced at the wallet in her hands, now clutched as if it were a lifeline, and something stirred in him, something he hadn't felt in years. He softened, though he didn't yet understand why. "Show me," he said after a long pause. "Show me your mother." The girl's eyes widened in surprise, but she nodded quickly, scrambling to her feet. Ethan followed her deeper into the alley, his mind racing with questions he didn't yet have the answers to. For the first time in years, he felt as though he might be stepping out of his own shadow and into someone else's story. The girl led Ethan through a maze of narrow, crumbling streets that seemed to belong to an entirely different world than the one he inhabited. Each corner revealed more of the city's neglected reality: children playing with broken toys, elderly figures seated on stoops, and tired mothers haggling over groceries in plastic bags. Ethan felt a wave of discomfort, not from the surroundings themselves, but from the realization of how removed his life was from places like this. Finally, they stopped in front of a small, dilapidated building. The faded paint and sagging roof betrayed years of neglect. The girl, Emma, pushed the door open and hurried inside. Ethan followed, the air inside stifling and carrying the faint, sour scent of sickness. The apartment was dimly lit, furnished only with a threadbare couch, a small wooden table, and mismatched chairs. On the couch lay a woman, her face pale, her dark hair matted against her forehead with sweat. She was breathing shallowly, her chest rising and falling with visible effort. "Mom," Emma whispered, kneeling beside her. She gently shook the woman's arm. "Mom, wake up. I got the money. I'll get your medicine now." The woman stirred weakly, her eyelids fluttering open for a brief moment. Her voice was a faint rasp. "Emma, you're back," she trailed off, slipping back into an uneasy sleep. Ethan stood frozen by the door, taking in the scene. The mother's frailty, the state of the apartment, and the desperation on Emma's face hit him with an unexpected force. This was not the life he had imagined for anyone, let alone a child so young. His mind, accustomed to analyzing profits and losses, couldn't reconcile what he was seeing. For the first time in years, he felt powerless. "Sir," Emma's voice broke his thoughts. She stood in front of him now, holding his wallet out with both hands. "Please. I'm sorry. I'll give it back. Just don't call the police. I didn't mean to steal. I didn't know what else to do." Ethan looked at her, the wallet in her trembling hands, and then at the woman on the couch. His voice, when it came, was quieter than he expected. "Where do you get the medicine?" "There's a pharmacy a few blocks from here," Emma said quickly, her eyes wide with hope. But it's expensive. We've been borrowing from neighbors. Selling what we can. But, she bit her lip. Tears threatening to spill again. Without another word, Ethan turned and walked out of the apartment, leaving Emma to stare after him in stunned silence. For a moment, she thought he had abandoned them. But minutes later, she saw him return, holding a small white bag with the pharmacy's logo. "Here," he said, handing it to her. "For your mother." Emma's face lit up with gratitude. She clutched the bag to her chest like a treasure and immediately knelt by her mother's side, coaxing her to wake and take the medicine. Ethan watched quietly as Emma's voice softened, urging her mother to sip the liquid medicine. The woman's breathing eased slightly, but her condition was clearly still critical. "She needs more than this," Ethan said, his voice firm. "She needs a hospital." "No," Emma cried, panic flashing in her eyes. "They'll make us pay up front. We don't have insurance." "Please, sir. I'll take care of her here. I just need." "She won't survive here," Ethan interrupted, his tone final. "We're going to the hospital." Emma hesitated, fear and hope battling in her expression. Then she nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. Ethan didn't reply. He was already on his phone, calling for an ambulance. Moments later, the flashing lights of an emergency vehicle lit up the street, and paramedics rushed inside. They carefully lifted Grace onto a stretcher, her frail body looking even smaller under the harsh fluorescent light. Emma held her mother's hand tightly, refusing to let go until one of the paramedics gently guided her into the ambulance. Ethan climbed in behind them without hesitation. As the doors shut, sealing them into the confined space, he watched Emma clutch her mother's hand and whisper, "It's going to be okay. Mom. You'll be fine now." Ethan wasn't so sure. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, heavier than any business deal he'd ever negotiated. For the first time in years, he felt a responsibility he couldn't quantify or delegate. At the hospital, doctors swarmed around Grace, moving with the efficient urgency of people who had seen too many lives teetering on the edge. Ethan stood back, his arms crossed, while Emma hovered near the doors, her small frame trembling as she tried to keep up with the doctor's words. "Sir," one of the doctors approached Ethan. "Her condition is critical. She'll need intensive care, and there's a new experimental treatment that might help. But I have to warn you, it's risky and extremely expensive." Ethan looked over at Emma, her wide, tear-filled eyes locked on her mother. Then he glanced at Grace, lying pale and fragile on the hospital bed. "Do it," he said without hesitation. "Do whatever it takes." The hours that followed were a blur of medical jargon, hurried footsteps, and the steady, haunting beep of machines monitoring Grace's fragile condition. Ethan remained in the waiting area, seated on a hard plastic chair. Across from him, Emma sat curled into herself, her small frame trembling as she clutched a threadbare blanket one of the nurses had given her. Despite the chaos of the hospital, she barely moved, her wide eyes fixed on the double doors that led to the intensive care unit. Ethan had never felt so out of place. In boardrooms, his sharp tongue and unflinching gaze could silence a room. But here, surrounded by people clinging to hope in the face of despair, he felt powerless. He wanted to say something to Emma, but the words wouldn't come. What could he possibly offer this child, other than money? And yet, for the first time, money didn't feel like enough. A doctor finally emerged from the double doors, her expression grave but professional. "Mr. Montgomery," she called, her voice steady but cautious. Ethan stood immediately, his height and tailored suit cutting an imposing figure. Emma followed hesitantly, clutching the edge of his jacket like it was a lifeline. The doctor gestured for them to step into a quieter corner. "We've stabilized her for now," she began. "But her condition is still precarious. The experimental treatment we mentioned earlier, it's her best chance. However, I need to stress the risks. The medication could trigger severe side effects, and her body may not be strong enough to handle them. Ethan listened intently, his jaw tightening with each word. "And if we don't try it?" he asked, his voice low and firm. The doctor hesitated, her professional demeanor slipping just slightly. "If we do nothing, she won't survive the night." A silence fell over the small group. Ethan glanced at Emma, who was looking up at him with tear-filled eyes. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please save her." Ethan nodded. "Do it," he said to the doctor, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "Whatever it takes." The doctor gave a quick, understanding nod before disappearing back into the ICU. Emma let out a small, shaky sigh, and for the first time, Ethan knelt down to her level. "They're going to do everything they can," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Your mom is strong. You've been strong for her." Emma blinked rapidly, trying to hold back her tears. But they spilled over anyway. "What if it doesn't work?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan hesitated. He wasn't used to giving reassurances he couldn't guarantee. "We'll cross that bridge if we have to," he said finally. "But right now, we have to believe it will." The hours dragged on, every second feeling like an eternity. Ethan paced the waiting room while Emma dozed fitfully on the chair, her small body unable to fight off the exhaustion any longer. The hospital buzzed around them, nurses moving quickly and quietly, families whispering in hushed tones. Ethan's phone buzzed constantly with calls and emails, but he ignored them all. For the first time in his life, work felt irrelevant. Finally, the doctor returned, her scrubs stained and her face drawn with exhaustion. "We administered the treatment," she said, her voice careful. "It's too soon to say for sure, but her vitals have improved slightly. The next 24 hours will be critical." Ethan exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing ever so slightly. Emma woke as the doctor spoke, rubbing her eyes and sitting up straight. "Can I see her?" she asked, her voice small but determined. The doctor hesitated, then nodded. "Just for a moment," she said. Ethan and Emma followed the doctor into the ICU, where Grace lay surrounded by machines. Her face was still pale, but there was a faint flush of color in her cheeks that hadn't been there before. Emma rushed to her mother's side, taking her hand gently. "Mom," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm here. We're going to get through this." Ethan stood back, watching the scene with a mix of relief and discomfort. He wasn't used to feeling helpless. Yet here he was, a silent observer in a story that wasn't his. And yet, as he watched Emma lean over her mother, whispering words of encouragement through her tears, he realized something he couldn't quite articulate. This wasn't about control or power or even charity. It was about something much deeper, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. As the night wore on, Ethan found himself sitting beside Emma again, their silent vigil stretching into the early hours. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about deals or profits. Instead, he was thinking about the fragile thread that held this little family together and how, despite all his wealth, it was Emma who had shown him what it meant to fight for something truly priceless. The days after the treatment were a delicate balancing act. Grace's condition stabilized, but the road to recovery was long and uncertain. Ethan watched as doctors and nurses moved with practiced precision, monitoring her progress around the clock. Emma rarely left her mother's side, her small hand often resting on Grace's, as though her touch alone could will her mother back to health. Ethan found himself returning to the hospital every day. At first, he told himself it was to ensure his investment in Grace's treatment wasn't in vain. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. Watching Emma's unwavering devotion to her mother had stirred something within him, a dormant sense of empathy he hadn't realized still existed. One afternoon, as he arrived at the hospital with fresh clothes for Emma, he noticed her sitting outside Grace's room, her knees pulled to her chest. Her head snapped up when she saw him, and though her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, She quickly tried to compose herself. "She's awake," Emma said, her voice trembling with a mix of relief and exhaustion. Ethan paused, his hand resting on the doorframe. Inside, Grace lay propped up on the hospital bed, her face pale but her eyes alert. When their gazes met, her expression was one of quiet gratitude. "You must be Mr. Montgomery," she said softly, her voice still weak. Ethan stepped into the room, suddenly unsure of himself. He wasn't used to being thanked, not in this way. "Call me Ethan," he said. Grace managed a faint smile, though her eyes flickered with vulnerability. "Ethan," she repeated. "Emma told me everything. I don't know how we'll ever repay you." "You don't need to," Ethan replied quickly, his tone firm. "Just focus on getting better." Grace's gaze shifted to Emma, who had entered the room and was now standing by her side. "You were so brave," Grace said, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Emma leaned into her mother's touch, tears glistening in her eyes. Ethan watched the interaction, his throat tightening. This wasn't a scene he was familiar with, this raw, unconditional love. He had spent his life surrounded by people who valued him for what he could offer, not for who he was. Yet here was a bond that required nothing but presence and devotion. Over the next few weeks, Grace began physical therapy. The treatment had saved her life, but it had left her body weakened, particularly her legs. Her therapists were optimistic about her chances of recovery, but the process would be grueling. Grace, however, met each session with quiet determination. Ethan found himself increasingly involved in their lives. When Grace was transferred to a rehabilitation center, he ensured she received the best care. He brought Emma new clothes and books to occupy her time. He even began staying late at the hospital, sitting in the waiting room while Emma slept in a nearby chair. "Why are you helping us?" Grace asked one evening, her voice tinged with curiosity. They were sitting by the window of her room, the city lights twinkling in the distance. Emma was asleep, her head resting on Ethan's jacket. Ethan hesitated, staring out at the skyline. It was a question he had been asking himself, too. At first, "I thought it was guilt," he admitted. "I chased your daughter through the streets and treated her like a criminal. When I saw what she was fighting for, it changed something." Grace studied him quietly. "And now?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Now I don't know. Maybe I'm trying to make up for all the times I didn't care enough to act." Grace nodded, her expression softening. "Whatever the reason, thank you." As the weeks turned into months, Ethan's involvement deepened. He started driving Emma to school and even attended a parent-teacher meeting when Grace was too unwell to go. The staff at the rehabilitation center began to recognize him, greeting him warmly whenever he arrived. It wasn't long before Ethan made an extraordinary decision. One day, as Grace completed another grueling therapy session, he approached her with a proposal. "I want you and Emma to come live with me," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Grace looked at him in disbelief. "Ethan, we can't." "You can," he interrupted. "Your apartment isn't safe. You need a stable place to recover. And Emma needs a chance to just be a kid. My house has more than enough room." Grace hesitated, her pride and gratitude warring within her. But when she glanced at Emma, who was watching the conversation with wide, hopeful eyes, her resolve softened. "All right," Grace said finally, her voice quiet. "We'll come." As Ethan drove them to his estate for the first time, he felt something he hadn't in years: contentment. The sprawling property that once felt cold and hollow now held the promise of something new: family. The Montgomery estate in Connecticut was a sprawling mansion surrounded by lush greenery, its grandeur reflecting Ethan's success. Yet, for years, it had been devoid of warmth, a hollow monument to a life built on ambition rather than connection. When Ethan pulled up to the gates with Grace and Emma, the atmosphere began to shift. The once imposing property felt as though it had been waiting for this moment. Waiting to become a home. Emma's eyes widened as the car rolled up the long driveway. "This is where you live," she whispered. Her voice a mix of awe and disbelief. Ethan glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his lips curving into a small smile. "It's where we all live now," he said simply. The car came to a stop in front of the grand entrance, where the polished marble steps gleamed under the late afternoon sun. Grace hesitated as Ethan opened the door for her, her hand gripping the edge of her seat. "Ethan. This is too much," she said softly, her voice heavy with unease. "It's not," he replied firmly. "You and Emma deserve this." With a deep breath, Grace allowed herself to be helped out of the car. Emma hopped out after her, her excitement breaking through. "Mom. Look at the flowers," she exclaimed, running toward the manicured garden. "It's like a fairy tale." Ethan led them through the grand front doors, where the polished wooden floors and high ceilings seemed to stretch endlessly. Emma's footsteps echoed as she darted from room to room, her laughter filling the space. Grace, meanwhile, took in her surroundings with cautious steps, her hands brushing over the smooth surfaces of the furniture. "It's beautiful," she said quietly, her voice tinged with hesitation. "It's yours now," Ethan said, his tone softer than she'd ever heard it. "All of it." Over the next few days, Grace and Emma began to settle in. Ethan had arranged for a room on the ground floor to be converted into a comfortable suite for Grace, complete with a small adjoining space for her physical therapy sessions. The walls were painted a calming shade of blue, and the large windows overlooked the garden, letting in plenty of sunlight. For Emma, Ethan had gone a step further. Her room was a vibrant space filled with bright colors and shelves stocked with books, art supplies, and toys. The look on her face when she first saw it was something Ethan would never forget. "I've never had my own room before," Emma whispered, her voice full of wonder as she ran her fingers over the soft bedding. "Well," Ethan said, standing in the doorway, "now you do. And it's yours to make however you want." Life at the estate began to take on a new rhythm. Grace spent her mornings in therapy, her determination unwavering as she worked to regain strength in her legs. Ethan often joined her during the sessions, offering quiet encouragement or simply being present. In the afternoons, Emma would explore the expansive grounds, often dragging Ethan along with her. "Mr. Montgomery," Emma said one day, tugging on his sleeve as they stood by a small pond at the edge of the property. "Do you think we could plant flowers here? Mom loves flowers." Ethan knelt beside her, his usually stern expression softening. "I think that's a great idea," he said. "We'll make this garden hers." True to his word, Ethan arranged for a section of the property to be transformed into a flower garden. Grace, despite her initial reluctance, became deeply involved in the project. She selected the seeds and helped Emma plant them, her joy visible in every careful motion. As the garden began to bloom, so did the sense of family within the house. Meals at the grand dining table were no longer silent affairs, they were filled with laughter and conversation. Emma would chatter about her day. Grace would tease Ethan about his unfamiliarity with cooking, and Ethan would find himself smiling more than he had in years. One evening, as they sat together in the garden under a canopy of stars, Grace turned to Ethan. "You've given us more than I ever thought possible," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Ethan shook his head. "You've given me something, too," he said quietly. "I didn't realize how empty this place was until you filled it." Emma, sitting between them, reached out and took both their hands. "We're a family now, right?" she asked, her eyes shining with hope. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat as he nodded. "Yes," he said. "We are." The house that once felt cold and lifeless had become a home, not because of its grandeur but because of the love and connection that now filled its walls. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a sense of purpose that went beyond himself, a purpose rooted in family, in second chances, and in the beauty of rebuilding lives. As the garden flourished, So did the lives of those within the Montgomery estate. Grace was regaining her strength. Her progress slow but steady. Emma, now thriving in a stable environment, was full of ideas about how to make the mansion feel even more like home. But something was stirring within Ethan, an idea he couldn't ignore. The experiences he'd shared with Grace and Emma had awakened in him a new sense of responsibility. Not just to them, but to others who were struggling in ways he'd never noticed before. One evening, as they sat in the garden together, Ethan brought up his idea. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice steady but thoughtful. "There are so many families out there, like yours, who are just one bad day away from losing everything. I have the resources to help. I want to do something meaningful." Grace looked at him curiously, her hands gently resting on her knees. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I want to start a foundation," Ethan said, his gaze shifting to Emma, who was busy arranging flowers in a small vase. "Something that provides housing, education, and medical support for families in need. I've been fortunate, more fortunate than I ever realized, and it's time I did something with that." Grace's eyes softened, and a smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. "That's a wonderful idea, Ethan," she said. "You can make a real difference." Emma's head shot up, her excitement palpable. "Can I help? Maybe I can tell the other kids what it's like to have a safe place." Ethan chuckled, ruffling her hair. "I wouldn't do it without you, Emma. You and your mom are my inspiration for this." Within weeks, the Montgomery Parker Foundation was born. Ethan threw himself into the project with the same drive that had once fueled his business empire. But this time, his motivation wasn't profit, it was the faces of children like Emma and mothers like Grace who needed a second chance. The foundation's first initiative was to renovate an old building in a struggling part of the city, transforming it into a shelter and resource center. Grace quickly became an integral part of the foundation. Despite her physical challenges, she insisted on being involved, visiting the center regularly to oversee the programs and offer encouragement to the families who came through its doors. Her warmth and understanding made her a beacon of hope for those she met. At one of the center's first events, a young mother approached Grace, her toddler clinging to her leg. "You don't know how much this means to us," the woman said, her voice breaking. "For the first time in months, I don't have to worry about where we'll sleep tonight." Grace reached out, taking the woman's hand in hers. "I do know," she said gently, "and I promise, you're not alone anymore." Emma, meanwhile, became a little ambassador for the foundation. She often helped greet new families at the shelter, her enthusiasm and empathy putting nervous children at ease. "It's okay," she told a shy boy one afternoon. "I was scared, too. But everything gets better here. You'll see." Watching them, Ethan felt a pride he hadn't known he was capable of. The man who once measured success in stock portfolios and acquisitions now found it in the smiles of the people whose lives were being transformed. The foundation's reach began to grow, drawing attention from others who wanted to help. Donations poured in, allowing Ethan to expand the programs to include job training and healthcare services. Soon, the foundation was not just a project, it was a movement. One that united people from all walks of life. One day, as Ethan stood in the center of the bustling shelter, Grace approached him, her steps steady as she leaned on a cane. "You've done something incredible here," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "We've done it," Ethan corrected her. "I couldn't have done this without you and Emma." Grace smiled, her eyes glistening. "You've changed so much, Ethan. The man I met in that alley wouldn't even recognize the man standing here today." Ethan nodded, his gaze sweeping over the center and the people it was helping. "I think I needed saving as much as you and Emma did," he admitted. As they walked together through the center, Emma ran up to join them, her face glowing with excitement. "Mom, Ethan, look at this." She held up a drawing she had made, a picture of the three of them standing in front of the mansion, with flowers blooming all around. Above their heads, she had written in careful block letters, Home. Ethan felt his throat tighten as he looked at the picture. It's perfect, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Grace placed a hand on his arm. You gave us a home, Ethan, she said softly. And now, you're helping so many others find theirs, too. Ethan glanced down at Emma, who was beaming up at him. And then at Grace, whose eyes shone with quiet strength. You two gave me something even greater, he said. You gave me a purpose. As the sun set that evening, casting a golden glow over the bustling center and the vibrant garden back home, Ethan realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing success. He was building something far more meaningful, a legacy of love, hope, and second chances. Life at the Montgomery estate blossomed alongside the garden Grace and Emma had brought to life. The once pristine but sterile grounds had transformed into a vibrant space bursting with color and purpose. Rows of daisies, sunflowers, and roses now framed the walkways, while a small corner was dedicated to vegetables and herbs. Emma called it their magic garden, a place where everything seemed to grow with love. Ethan often found himself wandering through it after long days, his hands tucked into his pockets as he marveled at how much life it brought to the estate. On one such evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he spotted Emma sitting cross-legged in the dirt, carefully arranging stones into a decorative border. Hard at work again? Ethan asked, his voice carrying a warmth that surprised even him. Emma glanced up and grinned, her cheeks smudged with soil. Mom says the garden is her happy place, so I'm making it perfect for her, she said proudly. Do you think she'll like it? Ethan knelt beside her, examining her handiwork. I think she'll love it, he replied. You've got quite the artistic eye, Emma. Emma beamed, then tilted her head thoughtfully. You know, Mr. Montgomery, how many times do I have to tell you? It's Ethan, he interrupted gently, smiling. She giggled. Okay, Ethan. I was just thinking, this garden isn't just for us. It should be for everyone. Like the families at the shelter. Maybe they could come visit someday. It might make them happy too. Ethan paused, struck by the simplicity and generosity of her suggestion. You're right, he said after a moment. We should share this with them. Maybe we can even build another garden at the shelter. One that everyone can help with. Emma's eyes lit up. Really? You mean it? Of course, Ethan said, ruffling her hair. You've got a way of coming up with great ideas. Emma. That night, over dinner, Ethan shared Emma's idea with Grace. They were seated around the dining table, which was no longer a space of quiet formality but a place of laughter and warmth. Grace listened as Emma excitedly explained her vision, her hands gesturing animatedly as she described rows of flowers and a space for children to plant their own seeds. That's a beautiful idea, Grace said, her voice tinged with pride. Gardens have a way of bringing people together. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his gaze settling on Grace. What if we took it a step further, he suggested. We could create a community space at the shelter, a garden. Yes. But also a play area. Maybe even a small kitchen where families can cook meals together. It could be a place where people rebuild their lives. Grace's eyes softened as she nodded. That sounds perfect. A real sanctuary. The project took shape over the following weeks. Ethan allocated a portion of the foundation's funds to the initiative, while Grace and Emma threw themselves into planning. They worked closely with landscapers, architects, and volunteers from the community, ensuring that every detail was thoughtfully designed. On the day the new garden and community space opened, the shelter buzzed with excitement. Families gathered to plant seeds in the garden, their laughter filling the air. Children ran through the play area, their joy unrestrained, while others helped their parents cook simple meals in the communal kitchen. Emma, dressed in her favorite overalls and a floppy sun hat, led a group of kids in planting rows of marigolds. You have to talk to them, she instructed, her tone serious. Plants grow better when you tell them nice things. Nearby, Grace sat in the shade with a group of mothers, sharing her story and offering words of encouragement. It's not just about surviving, she told them. It's about finding joy again. Even in the little things. Ethan stood at the edge of the garden, his hands in his pockets as he took it all in. The scene before him was vibrant and alive, a far cry from the cold, detached life he had once led. You've created something beautiful here, Grace said, joining him. We did this together. Ethan replied. He glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. This is the first time I've felt like I'm building something that truly matters. Grace smiled, her gaze drifting back to Emma, who was now helping a younger child dig a hole for a seedling. She's happy, Grace said softly. For the first time in a long time. She's truly happy. And so am I. Ethan's chest tightened at her words. But it wasn't sadness he felt, it was gratitude. You two brought this into my life, he said, his voice steady. I didn't realize how much I was missing until you showed me. That evening, as the last of the families left the shelter and the garden fell quiet, Ethan, Grace, and Emma stayed behind to admire their work. They sat together on a wooden bench beneath the stars, the warm scent of blooming flowers surrounding them. Emma leaned her head against Grace's shoulder, her voice soft and content. This is my favorite place now, she murmured. Grace wrapped an arm around her, her gaze meeting Ethan's. Mine too, she said. For Ethan. The moment was a quiet revelation. In that shared stillness, he realized that what they had built together wasn't just a garden or a shelter, it was a life worth living. One rooted in love, hope, and second chances. The success of the shelter and the community garden marked a turning point. Not just for Ethan, but for everyone involved. It became a place of hope, where lives were rebuilt one seed, one conversation, and one shared meal at a time. Ethan, who once measured his achievements by profits and acquisitions, now found himself driven by something far more meaningful, the smiles of children playing, the laughter of families reunited, and the whispered gratitude of people who had been given a second chance. Life at the Montgomery estate was thriving. 2. Grace continued her physical therapy with unwavering determination, her steps growing steadier each day. Emma flourished in her new environment, her curiosity and energy infecting everyone around her. The mansion had become a home, filled with warmth and connection, a stark contrast to the cold and empty space it had once been. One autumn morning, Ethan sat at the large kitchen table, his laptop open as he reviewed updates from the foundation. The kitchen was filled with the scent of coffee and freshly baked bread, and the sound of Emma humming a cheerful tune as she worked on a drawing. Grace walked in, leaning lightly on her cane, her face glowing with the kind of peace Ethan had never seen before. You're up early, Grace said, pouring herself a cup of tea. So are you, Ethan replied, glancing at her with a smile. How's the garden looking this morning? Beautiful, Grace said. Emma's sunflowers are taller than she is now. Emma looked up from her drawing, grinning. I told you they'd grow if you talked to them. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. I think your magic might be rubbing off on all of us. Emma. Grace sat down across from him, her expression growing thoughtful. Ethan. I've been meaning to talk to you, she began. I've been thinking about the foundation, about what it's done for us and for so many others. I want to be more involved. You're already involved, Ethan said. You're one of the reasons it's been so successful. I mean more than that, Grace said, her voice firm. I want to help run it. I know what it feels like to be on the edge, to feel like the world has forgotten you. I want to use my experience to help others the way you've helped us. Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying her. There was a fire in her eyes, a determination that reminded him of the woman he had first met in that cramped apartment. I think that's a great idea, he said after a moment. The foundation could use someone with your perspective. Grace smiled, relief and excitement washing over her. Thank you, Ethan, she said. From that day forward, Grace became an integral part of the foundation's leadership. She brought new ideas and a compassionate understanding that resonated deeply with the families they served. Her story of survival and resilience inspired countless people. And her presence gave the foundation a sense of authenticity that money alone could never buy. Emma, meanwhile, became a beloved figure at the shelter. Her boundless energy and kind heart making her a favorite among the children. She often led art workshops, teaching the kids how to express themselves through painting and drawing. Art helped me when I was scared, she told them. And it can help you, too. One evening, after a long day at the shelter, the three of them sat in the garden at the estate, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of gold and pink, the flowers swaying gently in the breeze. Do you ever think about how far we've come? Grace asked, her voice soft. Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Every day, he said. Sometimes it feels like a dream. It's not a dream. Emma chimed in, her voice full of conviction. We made this happen, together. Ethan looked at her, a smile tugging at his lips. You're right, Emma. We did. Grace reached over and took his hand, her eyes shining with gratitude. Thank you, Ethan. For everything. No, Ethan said, his voice steady. Thank you. You and Emma, you saved me as much as I saved you. Maybe even more. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Ethan felt a profound sense of peace. He no longer measured his success by the size of his bank account or the scope of his influence. Instead, he saw it in the laughter of a little girl, the strength of a mother who refused to give up, and the lives that were changing every day through the foundation. The Montgomery estate, once a symbol of isolation, had become a place of love and hope. And Ethan, Grace, and Emma, though brought together by chance, had built something unbreakable, a family rooted not in blood, but in the bonds of empathy, resilience, and a shared determination to make the world a better place. In the quiet glow of the moonlit garden, Ethan, Grace, and Emma sat together, their laughter mingling with the soft rustle of the flowers they had planted. The Montgomery estate, once a symbol of wealth and isolation, had become a sanctuary of love, resilience, and new beginnings. Through the challenges they had faced, they discovered the true meaning of family, a bond built not by blood, but by shared hope and compassion. As they looked toward the future, they knew their journey was far from over. There were still more lives to touch, more seeds of hope to plant. Together, they had created something far greater than they could have ever imagined, a legacy of love that would continue to grow. If this story inspired you, don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more heartfelt tales that celebrate courage, empathy, and the beauty of second chances. See you in our next story.